Well, there are obviously many lessons learned from avionics and all the IPTs on this flight, but there are some that I really would like to highlight. One is the use of the SIL, System Integration Laboratory. The SIL, all the testing we did in the SIL in Denver, which was hosted by Lockheed Martin, just paid off in all dividends. It allowed us to truly test things thoroughly in the lab before we ever got to the Cape. And when we got to the Cape, turning on power for the first time, doing integrated vehicle testing, worked basically seamlessly. We didn't have any issues with things that we were able to test in the SIL.
And there's some things that we learned from 1X that I'm hoping in the future, whatever vehicle we fly, we go follow some of those same parameters again, where we actually flew the vehicle end to end on the ground before it ever launched. And we flew that vehicle not only through what we called the SIL up in Denver, but then we used all that information plus the flight computer that was in Denver that went through all that testing and all that checkout, and we took that flight computer, stuck it in a flight vehicle, and then we flew the mission again on the ground before we launched it, and we made sure all that worked again. And it was that work with the SIL that was so important to minimizing, almost eliminating problems once we got into integrated testing. So this concept of test like you fly like you test, became very important.
I think one of the other big lessons learned that we gathered from the integrated test team and from my role as LP was the use of the SIL, Systems Integration Laboratory, out at Denver, which is essentially it's a whole avionics package that was exactly flight-like that we had on the rocket down here at KSC. All the components were the same, even the wire lengths were the same as what we had on the rocket. The reason that was so important was when we were developing our procedures, we develop our test requirements that we're going to go do this, and then when we actually develop the procedures, sometimes you realize that component didn't respond the way I thought it would. You could work out all those details in the lab so that before we got down here at KSC, when we actually put the flight hardware together, we had pretty much worked out all of our procedure problems. And, we'd actually change some test requirements based on, working out at the lab. And having that lab also available to us allowed us to do a lot of, I wouldn't call it system level testing, I'd call it system level simulation, where we actually had the entire test integration team in the firing room. We were plugged into the Denver SIL, and we were actually sending commands from KSC out to Denver. We were actually testing all those procedures, all that software that we had written. KSC guys were involved in that process, as well as the Denver guys and even the ULA guys on the Cape. But when you put it all together, you don't want to test that for the first time against real flight hardware. We tested it against the SIL in Denver, and that really shortened our, I think it really shortened our test time in the VAB.
And I think we all predicted we were going to have lots of avionics problems once we got into integrated testing. But because we did this stepstone approach, we were all pleasantly surprised that if you do test like you fly and fly like you test, by the time you actually get close to flying, your hardware is ready to go. And that was a fantastic lesson that I think that any future program should learn, very much so.
So that to me, from a programmatic standpoint, was a huge success and lesson learned. And if you were going to do this, another test flight, having a SIL-like environment was key.
Conversely, I can say that those things that we weren't able to fully test in the lab, like DFI, developmental flight instrumentation, things like sensors and such, you can't fully test those in the lab. There's just too many of them, and you can't simulate all the conditions for those various different sensors. Those are the things we ended up having to debug down at the Cape. And so what I would offer to the next project that does this is the use of an integrated simulation lab that truly has flight-like hardware in it, meaning having the same form, fit, and function as the flight boxes, and tests all the functions possible, especially things like anomalous conditions or unexpected conditions, is worth its weight in gold. And I would strongly encourage that the next avionics project incorporate a SIL into their thinking.
When we came into ARES 1X, we knew that this was a development test flight. It was not a operational production system that we're going to be operating for the next 30 years. So that allowed us to have a little leeway in decisions we were going to make as far as accepting more risk. One of the things that we did struggle with, though, is everybody said it's a test flight, we can take more risk. The standards out there don't really have a lot to say about how you do that and how you go about accepting that risk and dealing with it. So we specifically kept that mantra, it's a test flight, and we actually had to go to management and had a cover letter written by Dr. Griffin that allowed us, it's basically acknowledged this was a test flight and that we would be doing more risk. But as with anything, when it came time to launch, and we're 6 months away from getting ready to launch the vehicle, the system that's out there comes down, and people who aren't involved go, well, did you do this? Did you do that? Did you follow this process? Did you follow that process? And some of them we did, some of them we modified. We definitely tailored quite a bit, obviously all the time with management approval. But as you know, projects change. New people come in that didn't sign off on the last one, and so it's just, by the time you get 3 years into it, you have to train a whole new set of people. So that was definitely a challenge for us, and we definitely had to work through it. But at that point, we were committed, and the agency was committed to make it happen. One of the things that people always say, it's a flight test, we're going to take a risk. Well, taking risk is different than just going out there and doing things blindfolded. You want to take reasonable risk, and what I mean by that is, we had, for example, something we called a program test input, where we were going to do certain things to the vehicle, very minor inputs, known inputs, so that we can get a known output and actually understand the characteristics of the vehicle. That was key to us. Something that's done all the time in the aeronautics world for testing out airplanes. And so we believe this is the first time that this has been done on a rocket. And it was hugely successful, but there were a lot of people, a lot of consternation about doing this, about doing something other than was a totally nominal flight, and they felt that it was unreasonable risk. But you've got to do those things. And the way I look at risk, and the way I think some others look at risk, is that you decide what you want to do, you decide that it's important enough to get it done, you go do the proper analysis, you get the proper IV&V, you do the proper technical reviews, and you know that you've got it as good as you can do it, and then you go do it. There's always risks that something will go wrong. There's always a risk that, a lot of errors will line up and you'll have something slip through the system. But when you follow the process of doing the right analysis, you'll get to the point where you can do this and it's a reasonable risk. And so when somebody says to me, actually after the project was over, someone said to me in a review and says, you guys were lucky. And I looked at him and I said, well, I won't argue that we weren't lucky, because everybody's lucky when you launch a rocket. There's a million things that can go wrong. But I don't put it to luck. I put it to good technical people knowing exactly what they're doing the right analysis, having the right IV&V, and making sure that it would work, and it would work properly.
Another big takeaway from the ARES 1X project was that you can never discount the importance of the special testing, and if you don't plan properly, it will become your critical path. Some examples that I can give for what worked extremely well was our examples of doing a modal survey test on the vehicle. We actually had several distinct tests that we did at the element level and then at the full integrated vehicle level. And then an example of some tests that didn't execute as crisply, I would say, were the demonstration flight instrumentation tests that were also at the element level and the integrated vehicle level. In my mind, the two distinct areas that were different about those tests were the prior planning. You had an integrated Tiger team for the modal tests that started years prior to actually executing the tests, and the planning and analysis and teaming and level of trust that was built into that Tiger team occurred much, much earlier than as compared to the folks that were working the demonstration flight instrumentation tests. The other major difference between the two tests were the sheer magnitude of the tests. One was a little bit more scoped, and you understood when we're talking about modal test, you could understand where your boundary conditions were, what your limitations were, and what your interdependencies were based off of the rest of the vehicle assembly integration. Whereas when you're talking demonstration flight instrumentation tests, there were many more interdependencies, there were many more constraints in place, and there were many more things that came into play that made planning for that test of that magnitude much more difficult. So in hindsight, I would offer that if you have special tests you're going to do in a project, you need to have emphasis on those tests. You need to dedicate the necessary resources for the planning, for the execution, even for the post-test data analysis and your post-test assessments and really disengaging from those tests. Without that, you will find that those tests will become your critical path. When we were executing the demonstration flight instrumentation test configurations, they were being executed for the first time in that actual configuration with the test harnesses, with the laptops, with the software on the laptops, with the excitation of the sensors. So when we were doing those tests, we were realizing for the first time the bugs in the system, if you will. There was no upfront prior testing that was equivalent to the systems integration lab testing that was done on the rest of the avionics system. So it was a first, and it definitely was not expected to have seen what we saw. Some sensors needed stimulation in some ways. Some we couldn't get to; they were inaccessible. Some we had to access at the nearest production break. There were different reasons that the tests were hard, but the main reason was because we were doing it for the first time in that configuration with all the hardware talking to one another, and that was definitely a challenge.